Hi, my name is Paul Vander Klay. I'm the pastor of Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church, and this is my second in this series called Parenting Through Adulthood. This is an adult education class that is directed to people who have adult children, and they're trying to consider and do better in their relationships with them. We usually meet Sunday after church, maybe about once a month. You can check the website to find out more information. In session 2, I'm entitling it, In This World You Will Have Trouble. One of the things that I think we see in our particular cultural context in North America is that by virtue of watching television or going through the supermarket checkout, we all have this expectation that life should be easy, beautiful, comfortable, and secure. This isn't the case. And to the degree that these things inhabit our expectations, often when trouble arises, then we're not only disturbed by the trouble we have, we feel entitled and somehow offended because we're having trouble at all. Part of this, I think, is built into our culture, and part of this has come through a lot of idealism in our culture. I'm not going to throw all of this at the feet of Walt Disney, but Disney has certainly been a part of this. And what's ironic about that is that Disney himself had a very difficult childhood. His relationship with his father early on, as he was trying to get started in business, was bad. His father was a failure in many of the business enterprises that he pursued, and a lot of Disney's relationships with his family were not always easy, at least with his father and sometimes with his brother. And so this for me highlights the fact that we shouldn't carry around these expectations that life will somehow be easy and glorious and beautiful and secure, and that if life isn't working out this way, then somehow someone has wronged us. This is partly the nature of this world. Now, this quote from Jesus comes towards the end of the Gospel of John, when there's this interesting section where the disciples seem to finally be getting it. They're trying to understand who Jesus is, and they're all excited because they're imagining that because they know Jesus is going to have the power to make their life beautiful and glorious and secure and wonderful. If you read the Bible, you'll know that really the life of the disciples after they met Jesus in some ways was worse than their life was before. If your goal is to be happy and secure and successful in a rather middle-class consumerist way. His disciples, after knowing Jesus, became leaders of this movement. Most of them died young at the hands of another, and they lived their lives, in many ways less comfortably than, let's say, the other Galileans that were fishermen and doing whatever in Galilee who stayed in Galilee. At the same time, the disciples would not have exchanged this. And so Jesus tells them right out the door, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And figuring out exactly how Jesus has overcome the world and how that plays in our lives is not a simple or easy thing. And again, part of the problem is because of this expectation and imagination that what life is really about is happiness, understanding happiness in a rather shallow, facile, consumeristic way. At the same time, all of us want our children to be happy. All of us want our children to flourish. But it isn't immediately obvious that this is really what life is about, either from a religious perspective or even from a secular one. If you take someone and you give them absolutely everything they need, you make their life totally secure, they will probably look for some mission or some agenda or some cause or some way to thrill themselves just out of boredom. Life is not just about happiness, even though happiness is obviously a good thing. Now, there's an atheist psychologist who writes a rather popular blog called Slate Star Codex, and he has in 2015 he wrote a piece on just how bad things are. Now, as he describes himself, he's an atheist, successful psychologist who works with people. And this is how he describes his practice. I work in a wealthy, mostly white college town, consistently ranked one of the best places to live in the country. If there's anywhere that you might dare hope hasn't filled the brim with people living hopeless lives, it would be here. But that hope is not realized. Every day I get to listen to people describe problems that would seem overwrought if they were in a novel, and made up if they were in a think space of the fragmentation of American society. A perfectly average patient would be a 70-year-old woman who used to live somewhere else but moved a few years ago after her husband died in order to live closer to family. She has some medical condition or another that prevents her from driving or walking around much, and the family she wanted to be closer to have their own issues. So she has no friends within 500 miles and never leaves her house except to go to the doctor's appointments. She has one son who is in jail, one daughter married to a drug addict. She has one grandchild. Her only remaining joy in the world, with her drug-addicted son-in-law, uses access to him as a bargaining chip to make her give him money from her rapidly dwindling retirement account so he can buy drugs. When she can't cough up enough quickly enough, he bans her from visiting or talking to her grandchild. Plus, she tells the grandchild it's her fault. Her retirement savings are rapidly running out, and she has no idea that what she will do when they're gone. Probably end up on the street. And alas, her dog has died. Now again, in reading this, you'd think, oh, that's terrible. But as a pastor, I know this stuff is not unusual. This kind of thing happens all the time. Now, you might go to the grocery store, or you might go into church and look around, and people are dressed nicely, and they're calm and sitting in the chair. And you might think about your own problems and look at these other people who don't have your problems and say, wow, they don't seem to have any problems. Why do I have all the problems? But a story like this is not at all unusual. This, in fact, I would say is normal. Scott Peterson goes on to run a little script about what is pretty much normal in our society. About 1% of people are in prison, 2% are on probation, 1% are in a nursing home, 2% have dementia, 20% of people have chronic pain, 7% of people have depression in any given year, 2% of people are cognitively disabled, 1% of people are schizophrenic, 20% of people are on food stamps, 1% of people are wheelchair bound, 7% are alcoholics, 0.5% are chronic heroin users, that's probably now larger given the opioid epidemic, 5% of people are unemployed, 3% of people are former workers now receiving disability, 1% of people are experience domestic violence each year, 10% of people were sexually abused as children. 9% of people have been raped during their lifetime. This is normal. So then he kind of runs through a script and says, of any 20 people you meet, so if you're sitting in a room of 100 people, magnify this times 5. One has you've got chronic pain, alcoholism. You've got about 9 people that supposedly have no problem. But he said, now remember, this doesn't count all the problems that don't fall in any of the quantified categories, like everyone hates them because they're really ugly and annoying. And it doesn't count things like, I can't find good statistics on, I had a child die recently. It doesn't count things I would have gotten in trouble for, including autism or a single mother. It doesn't count a lot of things. And considering the patient that he mentioned, it doesn't even count her. And what this means is that this world is full of trouble. And the fact that you and your child and your relationship with your child, maybe all of your children, maybe a few of your children, is fraught, doesn't mean that this is unusual or strange. It means this is pretty normal. Now, I know you watch TV, and the people on TV don't have problems. The beautiful people on the magazine covers and the newsstands don't have problems, except perhaps the National Enquirer or something like that. They have problems, or we're kind of enjoying their problems. This is normal life in this world. In this world, you will have trouble. Now, what I'm doing as part of this class is that there are question sets. And these question sets are for you to think about. And we'll probably do some discussion when I run the class live this Sunday after church. What illusory expectations have you absorbed from your culture? Think about those. What expectations have you absorbed? So now when you realize your relationships with your children are not great, now you're not only upset by the relationship, you're upset that you have this problem. Well, like I said, this problem is pretty normal. So maybe we should work on getting beyond that. How do those expectations double your suffering? What helps calibrate those illusory expectations? And hopefully this video will help calibrate those expectations. Now, one of the things I want to ask, and again, many of the people taking my class are the age of my parents, who is ready to be a parent? I was watching television the other night with my wife, and there was a beautiful young couple talking about how all their dreams have come true and their children were small, and you look at them and you think, you know what? They haven't even started life. They haven't even started having problems. They're just getting going. They have no idea what life is going to hand to them. And so if you're an adult, maybe someone my age or maybe someone my parents' age, think about how old you were when you parented your children. You were probably in your 20s or 30s. Now looking back on that, what did you know? What couldn't you have known? A lot of times I find parents beat themselves up with expectations about perfect parenthood in the ways that they failed their children. Well, it's not surprising they failed their children. We all fail our children. No one in this world has a perfect parent, and you weren't a perfect parent either. And there are degrees to this. Now, obviously, there were likely far worse parents than you, and there were probably some better parents than you, and you were probably average, below average, or above average, but you were somewhere in that bell curve. How much more wisdom have you gained now? And in fact, aren't we still gaining wisdom? So before you go beating yourself up too much about what you did as a parent, consider how young you were when you were a parent. So my second question set is, have you come to terms with your limitations when you were parenting your young children? Quite likely, you were getting, one of you in the household was getting started in a career, money was tight, there were difficulties, and again, all of this is kind of pitched to a North American context. There are people around the world who have things far harder than we do, and this all impacts their children and their children growing up. It's all part of this big picture of this world within which we have trouble. Can you have some compassion for the relative youth of your children who perhaps are now parents? Can you encourage them for doing what they are doing well? I know if you're probably looking, let's say your children are themselves parents and you're worried about your grandchildren, what are your kids doing well in parenting? Are you sharing that with them? Are you encouraging that with them? Even though something may be bubbling up within you in annoyance or aggravation or frustration or real anger about how your children are failing, it's also important to recognize some of the positive and encourage them, and that might in fact give your kids a little bit more balance in terms of your relationship with them. Now I want to talk a little bit about the dimensions of the challenge. Now when we talk about this topic relating to adult children, we're going to talk a lot about boundaries. And boundaries are questions of what is mine, what is not mine, what is my responsibility, what is my child's responsibility, how can I manage these questions? Most treatments of this topic focus on boundaries, when to say yes and when to say no. But there's a broader dimension to this, which is part of the reason we're doing this in the context of a church. Because when to say yes and when to say no is connected to bigger questions such as what is life for? How should I live? Now, a good therapist can help work through a lot of emotional stuff and the boundary stuff, but there are larger elements here which I think lands it within the religious realm. And one of the questions is, why do you go to church? Maybe you don't go to church. Maybe you don't go to church regularly. Maybe you don't have a relationship with anybody at church. Jesus' summary of the law basically said that, well, what should we do? What is life about? What are the rules of life about? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, loving your neighbor, as Jesus taught, includes your enemies, and all of that easily includes your children. And so in a sense, what Jesus says is that a big part of what we're supposed to do here is be reconciled to our Maker, who is God, and be reconciled to one another. And what you'll realize, listening to that little vignette by Scott Alexander, is that so often our enemies, or the people who are most difficult for us to be reconciled to, are in fact our family members. And there's some wisdom to that, because people are difficult. And with people that we know on the street or work with or go to school with or have less intimate relationships with, well, it's pretty easy to manage those relationships because we don't care. We can keep them at arm's length. If they're annoying, we'll avoid them. but what do you do with your family members? And that's really where the gospel needs to get some traction and where we need to get a hold of some of our own stuff. Suffering in this challenge, you can pretty much assume will happen. To be in an intimate relationship is to suffer. One way or another, suffering will come to it. Can you love God who lets you suffer? Can you love your child who makes you suffer? These really are the challenges, and these are the challenges why we need Christianity and why we go to church and what we should be working on. Because the Christian story is a dramatic story. It's an extreme story. It's the story of the most innocent of victims suffering the worst possible suffering in seemingly the most pointless, humiliating way for the greatest possible outcome. That's essentially the story of Jesus, his incarnation, his death, and resurrection. And now then we wonder, well, we probably sit with Jesus and think, well, we've got Jesus here. Jesus is going to fix our suffering. But as C.S. Lewis points out, Jesus doesn't really fix the disciples' suffering. Jesus doesn't really fix his friends' suffering. What Jesus, in a sense, tries to do is make our suffering like his. Now, part of how this works out is that if you're going to actually sustain a successful relationship with your adult child, or perhaps with your disabled parent, or perhaps with your obnoxious spouse, you're going to have to learn how to suffer with grace. You're going to have to learn how to take an emotional blow. You're going to have to learn how to return good for evil. When we read the New Testament and we hear Jesus say things like, you should love your enemy, we think, well, that's really advanced Christianity, and I'm fine just kind of being a marginal Christian, and if I stay a marginal Christian, that's really all I want. But you discover that loving your enemy is not an unrealistic thing. If in fact your child is in some ways your enemy, or your spouse is your enemy, or your parent is your enemy, your task is really to learn to love your enemy. And the way you're going to learn that is to learn to suffer and to behave properly when you suffer. Part of what it means to be a human being is that when we experience suffering, we look for someone to blame, and either we try to fix it if we can, which is a positive thing, or we try to get even with the person who has caused us suffering. And in fact, these things drip down into our psyches and drip down into our behaviors, and it's the reason we avoid our children, or get passive-aggressive with our children, or lecture our children, or nag our children. Most of these things not really helping a whole lot. And so one of the things you're going to have to get in touch with is how your pain drives you in the relationship. Often when people speak out, they speak out to relieve their own pain. So maybe your adult child is frustrating you in some way. Maybe they spend money poorly. Maybe they have a gambling problem. Maybe they're not treating their children as you think they should. Maybe they're not keeping their house as you should. So you walk up there, you feel the pain, and you lash out with your mouth. Now what that does is it makes you feel better because you vented to them, but you probably haven't helped the relationship, which means that a big part of this is going to be, again, learning to suffer. When you walk up to your child's house and you see something in disarray and you're reminded of all the trouble they have that's causing you pain, can you absorb the pain and figure out how to engage the relationship positively? Can you not use the pain as an excuse to lash out at them verbally, to avoid or abandon them to relieve your pain? Sometimes because of pain, you white in as a problem solver, and you're going to pay their bills, and you're going to bail them out, and you're going to do things for your child because you can't really stand the pain, even though your bailout isn't really helping them. Your bailout is just about the pain you're experiencing. Even if you do everything right, and this is, again, the pain of being in this world where we will have trouble, even if you do everything right in the relationship, you cannot guarantee the outcome that you want. In other words, even if you absorb the pain, even if you hold your tongue, even if you figure out exactly the right time when to say yes, when to say no, when to help them out with money, when to say no to their money requests, when to say yes to caring for the grandchild, when to say, no, I can't really do it today, even then you may not guarantee the outcome you want. And that is a fact of life. Now, this mirrors our relationship with God's sovereignty, because sometimes people say, well, what a friend we have in Jesus. And then other people say, well, if all of my friends treated me like God does, I'm not sure I'd call them my friend. Because we have issues. If God is perfectly good and perfectly just and perfectly powerful, and we're suffering in it seemingly a pointless way, well, what kind of a friend lets us suffer? Now, ironically, these are probably the kinds of questions your children, if you're enforcing some boundaries, are thinking about you. And what this means is that our relationship with God and how we work this out is very much connected with our relationship with our children and how we work this out. This may very well be why Jesus pretty much forefronts the image of God as our Father. We have all the same relational issues with God as we do with our children, but we're probably having them from the other side. Now, a big part of religion is often trying to control God. And so maybe we're going to be passive-aggressive with God. Maybe things happened in our life and we suffered in a way, and we're going to get back at God by not going to church or not giving money or being mean to our neighbor in such a way that is to try to get back at God. You are tempted to try to control God, just like in some ways you're tempted to try to control your struggling child. So you find ways to manipulate. You find ways to exert control. You find all kinds of ways to solve the problem. But again, our relationship with God and our relationship with our children are mirroring each other. And so this is part of the reason why we work on this whole thing as a package. Now, the crazy thing about the God of the Bible is that he doesn't need us. But the God of the Bible invites us into his relational space and opens himself to our influence and our pain. That is an alarming thing, because if you know people in this world and you look at what Scott Alexander says about people and you know how we're bound to get ourselves into trouble, why would God want to relate with us? But he doesn't avoid us. He doesn't stonewall us. He is open to our influence, which is what prayer is about, but he also doesn't limit himself from our pain. Now, this is where Jesus' words, "In this world you will have trouble, but I have overcome the world." Okay, what does that mean? What does that look like going forward? You see, the character strength and assets you develop in relating to God are exactly what you need in your most demanding relationships in your life, which are the most intimate. And your most intimate relationships in your life are your family relationships. Your relationships with your spouse, your relationships with your parents, your relationships with your siblings, your relationships with your children. And so this is why working on all of this together, our relationship with God and our relationship with each other, is deeply connected. So the last question set for this session: do you know why you feel so conflicted when trying to figure out what to say and when to say it? Do you know why you're so conflicted? Maybe write some of those down. Maybe tell a friend. Why do you feel so conflicted? And what are those internal conflicts driving you to do? Can you differentiate your need for pain relief as opposed to what they might need from you, even if that is by no means certain? In other words, your child is struggling and you're frustrated and you want to do something or you want to avoid them. Well, this is all of the pain inside of you working itself out, and it's driving you one way or another. Can you differentiate that pain from what your child actually needs from you in the relationship and figure those kinds of things out? Can you see yourself as God's frustrating child as you see your most frustrating child vexing you? In other words, Jesus pulls this in "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." Jesus pulls this in the parable of the unforgiving servant. What Jesus says basically is that we are God's problem child. And so if we see ourselves as God's problem child, well, maybe we'll have a little bit more emotional resources to deal with our own problem children. And so then you might ask the question, how does God parent you? Does God let you get into trouble? Does God allow suffering into your life? Does God Does God work with you sometimes in ways that you don't like? I would say yes, he does. What are those issues? What wise counselors outside the relationship do you have to think outside the pain echo chamber? All of us need people to talk to. Now, all of us need people to talk to about relationships, often outside of those relationships. You need to find those people. It might be your spouse. It might be a friend. It might be a pastor. It might be a therapist. Who can you talk to kind of work through these things verbally before you actually put them into practice with your child or whatever relationship you're struggling with? Are you using them? So that's this week's lesson. And again, if you're interested, leave a comment. It's this coming Sunday is December 2, 3, 4. And we will be meeting after church at the Round Table Pizza on Florin Road. If you'd like to come, you'd be most welcome. It's pay for yourself pizza, and it's a buffet. They've got a nice salad bar. You can get all you can eat pizza. And we'll be going through this. There'll be opportunity to share, but no one will be required to share. So thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful.